In this episode, we're going to look at how we can test React's lifecycle methods. I've updated our user component to react to when its ID prop changes and to make a new HTTP request when that happens. So now alongside the coding component.didMount that fetches a user, we also have component.didUpdate. This checks if the ID has changed, and if it does, it fetches a user with the new ID. This means if we've rendered our user component with an ID of 1 and then we change it to have an ID of 2, it will remake the HTTP request. If you're using a component with a library such as React Router, this could happen quite a lot. When React Router's URL changes, it won't necessarily re-render your entire component from scratch, unmounting it and mounting it again. Instead, it will just change its props. So it's important when you have components that make HTTP requests based on props that you make sure they react to those properties changing. Let's look at how we can test this in our user tests. So this is the code we have from before, and we're able to mock our user with a fake promise. And we have a test that checks that we show the loading text, and then we have another test that checks that we show the data once it's been fetched. Let's write another test that checks when we change the user's ID, it makes a new HTTP request. I'm going to start by just copying and pasting the it shows the data test, and we'll change that to say it makes a new HTTP request when the ID prop changes. So what we're going to do is we're going to render the user component shallowly, as we have been doing. That will call component.didMount. Enzyme then provides a function called setProps, which we can call to update the props of the component that we've mounted. So at this point, I can call wrapper.setProps, and I'm going to pass in an ID of 2. And this will trigger a component.didUpdate call, because this setProps call will update the properties being given to our user component that's been mounted. If I hit save now, we'll see that that test does pass. However, it's not actually proving anything. We're mocking that the user responds with the dummy user, but this means that we're responding with the same user every single time we make the request to call fetch user. So although the ID has changed, we don't actually know that the right data is being re-rendered. Instead, what we want to do is mock the request to perform differently the first time we call it to the second time we call it. And there's a couple of different ways we can do that. The first thing is I'm going to go and grab the body of this mock fetch user response function and pull it into this test, because we're not going to be able to reuse this function. We need to write some new code to mock this scenario. So I've just pulled in the function and put its body in here. So we're spying on the fetch user and we're mocking the implementation to just resolve with our dummy user. What I'm also going to do is create another user, and I'll just call this another dummy user. We'll give it an ID of 2, a name of Alice Bob, and a website of, I don't know, bbc.com. So what we want to do is the first time that our component mounts, it should make a call and get the dummy user back. The second time, it should make a call and get another dummy user back. And we can check that the right data has been rendered. So there's a couple of ways we can do this. The mock implementation call that Jest provides will be called with any arguments that we call the function with. So when our component is calling fetch user, it's passing in an ID of 1 or 2 or whatever it might be. So we could change this test to take in the ID, and depending on the ID, resolve to a different user. So here we can say if ID equals 1, we'll return that user. Else if the ID is 2, we'll return another dummy user. You'll see now that these tests down here are failing, and they're failing because we actually want to be asserting on the new user now another dummy user rather than dummy user. So that code works. So with that, we know now that we're setting props and we're fetching a new user. However, I find this code for spying on fetch user a bit hard to understand now. What happens if a test calls mock implementation with an ID that isn't 1 or 2? There's also some implicit knowledge here. We know that we're expecting fetch user to be called twice. Once with the ID of 1 when we first mount the component, and then again with an ID of 2 when we call setProps. But this mock implementation declaration doesn't tell us that. It just tells us that if you call it with 1, you get a dummy user. If you call it with 2, you get a different dummy user. Instead, what we want to be able to do is mock an implementation for each of the calls we're expecting and no more. And we can do this using a function called mock implementation once. What I'm going to do up here is I'm going to go back and I'm going to mock implementation once, and for the first time I'm going to declare a function that will return promise.resolve with our dummy user. Mock implementation once returns just again, so you can then chain these calls. So I'll add another mock implementation once call. And this time I'm going to return promise.resolve another dummy user. We also don't need this explicit return here. And if I delete this code and let it be reformatted, it should look a bit clearer to you. And we're still passing, but now what's really clear to me is exactly how we're expecting fetch user to be called as part of this test. Let me just make the atom window a bit bigger so you can see without the confusing indentation. And now it's really clear as someone reading this test exactly what's going on. And it's fairly straightforward to map. Well, the first time it runs, it will probably get this user, and then the second time when we set the props, it will get another dummy user. If you wanted to be really thorough, you could also check that dummy user is rendered the first time. So what you might decide to do is pull this code up into here, and here we'll update another dummy user to be dummy user. And you can see that the test's still passing. You can do this, but you'll notice now that this test is becoming very, very long. I actually don't think we require these tests. These tests here are effectively testing that when we mount a component, it makes a request and it fetches the user's data. But we already have that test. This is that test here. It shows the data once it has been fetched. So we don't need to remake that assertion in another test because we already have it. That's why I'm quite happy to miss out this first assertion and just render the component, set its props, and then check that the new user is being rendered. When you spy on a function using jest, you can also check how it's being called and how many times it's being called. So if you wanted to be really thorough and also make the tests a bit more explicit, we could say here, after we've mounted the component first, I can say that I expect api.fetchUser to have been called. This is an assertion I can make on the fetchUser function because we're spying on it with jest. If I hit save there, you'll see that still passes. However, this test isn't very thorough, because although it checks that fetchUser has been called, it doesn't check what it's been called with. I can change this assertion to say to have been called with, and pass in the ID of 1 that I'm expecting. You'll see that that test now passes again, but it's now much more clear. If I change that to a 5, for example, we'll now get an error. So if you wanted to be really explicit in your test, you could also document exactly what the fetchUser function should be called with. So I can check there that it's been called with an ID of 1, and down here, I'll check that it's been called with an ID of 2. You might decide that you don't need this, and just because you're setting the props and then you're getting the new dummy user, that's enough to make you happy that everything's working correctly. However, because mock implementation once doesn't care about the ID it's called with and it will always return the same data, having this extra assertion makes it a bit clearer what's going on. You've got to remember that a second functionality of tests is to help you as a developer understand what's happening. So adding in this extra assertion makes it really clear to me. Imagine if you come back to this code in 6 months, or if this is a code one of your colleagues wrote that you have to work on, it's very clear that when you first call it, it's going to fetch user based on that ID, and then when the props change, it should use that ID to fetch the new user. This might seem straightforward now, but if you come back to a React component a few months after you wrote it and it's got some complex HTTP logic in it based on properties or state, you'll be really grateful of some extra explicit tests that help you along the way.